So I'd be interested how you explain it to people because depending on who you're explaining Bitcoin to for the first time, or maybe they know a little bit, the attributes that you would put forward or the story you tell would be different. So if you're, I don't know, if you've got somebody in Ukraine who's trying to flee the country and you want to
Yep.
explain Bitcoin to them, there's certain properties you would be talking about, self custody and censorship resistance, yada yada. But if you were explaining it to, I don't know, somebody based out in, I don't know, maybe in Africa who is
Mhm.
suffering under high inflation, you would explain it to them in a different way. But when you're talking to a high net worth individual,
In the
where
United
in the
States.
United
Right.
States, how do what is it you're telling them?
I think the most constructive narrative is digital gold. And
Okay.
it's easy to differentiate, as you know, ad nauseum, the why Bitcoin is so much better than a digital gold for an infinite number of reasons that we don't have to rehash. But that's the conversation that I have. It's there was gold, this is a digital gold. Every digital successor of every analog predecessor has not just equaled their predecessor, they have like crushed it, whether you can think of traditional phones, rotary phones, and mobile phones kind of thing, right?
Mhm.
And it is reasonable to think that Bitcoin is a digital gold. um, and they invariably have children or grandchildren, and it's easy to explain to them that their child or grandchild doesn't have any interest in the bar of gold that they have in their safe, but they would have interest in Bitcoin. And they quickly start to understand why younger generations who grew up with an iPad or an iPhone in their hand would gravitate towards this. Those are the same people that had no problem spending $10 on a skin in a video game when they were just a kid and thought it had real value, whereas the parent was like, that's just pixels on a screen. So I think that that resonates. And it, you get most of the phone calls that I have occur with some matriarch or patriarch on the phone, this 65, 70-year old very wealthy individual, and their kid on the phone with them, or their grandkid in some cases. And it's like, well, my kid's been telling me about this for years, and they dismissed him, but now it's on the front page of all the newspapers they read and CNBC, which they're watching all day. And now they want to know about it, and they don't want to look stupid having missed out. So digital gold, I think, is the most constructive narrative. But in addition to that, you look at gold at roughly, 10 plus trillion dollars. I think it's also the most constructive narrative for the success of Bitcoin, not just for, potential affluent American investors. If we get to, $10 trillion dollars as a market cap on Bitcoin, or even half of that, I think a lot of stuff starts to fall into place. And yes, Bitcoin's got battles that it wants to fight, but those battles go a lot differently, at 250,000 per BTC.
Well, is that because somebody was explaining to me once there's some investors who can't invest in Bitcoin because the market isn't just big enough?
I'm not sure. Maybe at the nation state level, some might think that, but I don't think so. I mean, Sailors bought what, $4 billion worth of this stuff. I think I think it's big enough.
Who was telling us that? Do you remember that? Was it
I
Travis?
I remember the conversation. Someone was talking about like $1 trillion market cap being some sort of limit, but I can't remember who it was.
Yeah, it might have been Travis Kling.
No, I think it's big enough for anybody that wants to invest. I think actually you get tremendous. What I'm surprised hasn't happened is because it's so thinly traded relative to other stuff on a dollar basis. I'm surprised that some nation state sovereign wealth fund, massive hedge fund has not come in and said, well, shit, I can, you know, accumulate a few $1 billion worth of this stuff on the DL dollar cost, just, set a TWAP time weighted, and just buy, every second for a month and accumulate a bunch of it. And then you can actually drive the price up. I mean, if the Saudis did that, if they bought $10 billion worth of Bitcoin, $50 billion worth of Bitcoin over a course of a couple months, and then they announced, oh, we're going to price oil in Bitcoin or something, the price of Bitcoin would go up 10x. You know, if a nation state, if a Turkey who is having all these issues were to print a bunch of Turkish lira and buy, a couple $1 billion worth of Bitcoin, and then announce something positive in some way. We're backing our currency with Bitcoin, or we're doing something else with Bitcoin. Like, boom, like you'd get this massive self-fulfilling prophecy on an investment, even a hedge fund. A Bill Ackman could say, I bought $5 billion worth of Bitcoin, and then announce it after the fact. And people go, holy shit, Bill Ackman bought $5 billion worth of Bitcoin. And anybody who was short it would cover their short, and a whole bunch of other people would go long. So it's not a security. So you can do that without it being securities violations or fraud. So there's just tremendous opportunity for some big player to do something like that.
And these people phoning you, and perhaps they're sat there with their son or grandson saying, I've heard about this. They're tracking the cultural phenomenon that is Bitcoin. They understand.
Yeah.
What kind of pushback are you getting? What are the things they're asking?
Initially, it was mostly the regulatory stuff. That was the big deal.
Really?
And, we live, eat, and breathe this stuff every day. They don't know about Lummis and Gillibrand and the bill. They don't know about the president's executive memorandum, you know, ordering people to regulate this pragmatically. They're not aware of these things. They might still have these misconceptions that this is going to get outlawed, and you just kind of have to update them on, well, here's where we really are. And, we have bipartisan support. How many other things have you heard of in the United States that actually have bipartisan support? Not a lot.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, that's been on my mind a lot recently. Is that if you want to cover Bitcoin from the angle of conservative politics, there's a lot of people out there you can talk to. And if you want to cover it from a libertarian angle, there's a lot of people you can talk to. On the more progressive, liberal left side, there
Yeah.
isn't so many people, and we're actively trying to pursue people to talk about it from that side. I think it's really important that it is a
Yeah.
non-partisan issue. I think what Senator Gillibrand and Senator Lummis did was incredible, and big props to them for that. We've got a guy coming down in the next couple of days who's working on a book called The Progressive Case for Bitcoin.
Mhm.
And we've gone through the original structure with him, and it's fantastic. He's approaching all the issues that
Yeah.
progressives care about, and he's shining a Bitcoin lens on that. And rather than get into fights of criticizing people for their political beliefs, actually we can get in this more proactive space where we can start actually saying, well, if you care about this is what Bitcoin can do for wealth inequality or the wealth gap, or this is what it can do to support climate change issues. There's all these
Yeah.
issues that we can deal with, and I think what that does, it stops us fighting over our differences and start trying to empathize with our differences and use Bitcoin as that kind of that tool to bring people together.
I think the case for the progressives and the liberal left is by far the strongest case that Bitcoin has to make. I think that you've got a tremendous percentage of this country as well as the world that is unbanked. And to be able to have those people ostensibly be banked just by having a smartphone, which they already have, is pretty remarkable. Take it to the next level, the fact that they might be banked and be able to hold their wealth in something like Bitcoin that's not going to get crushed by inflation like the dollar would. Now you're narrowing that wealth gap a little, because if you're in that upper class, that asset owning class of people, inflation is bad, but it's not that bad because you own assets, real estate, stocks, other things that are inflating with this inflation. You're getting that asset inflation benefit. But if you're living paycheck to paycheck, you literally cannot afford the gas and the groceries, and you don't have the benefit of those assets inflating to offset that. So the fact that they could be holding Bitcoin on their smartphone in kind of like a savings account, and in the same simple wallet when they want to transact, swap into a stable coin or USDC or whatever to do a transaction, that could really, really help them in multiple ways. Number one, they could save because now they have a bank. And number two, they can fight inflation. So I think the use case is really extraordinary.
Yeah, we had Ovik Roy on the show from FreeOp. I don't know do you know Ovik?
I don't know him personally, but yeah.
I think you'd get on well with him. We made a show recently with him because they wrote a piece covering the compounding effects of inflation on the poor. And even at 2%, the traditionally targeted 2% government inflation, that has a compounding impact on the poor. And actually, did he get to the point it's like almost anything above zero inflation?
Well, yeah, and he was really getting into how it, like, the impact of inflation is way outsized for the poorest in society. Like, it affects them the most.
Yeah.
Without a doubt, without a doubt, because that compounding effect is so insanely dramatic.
Yeah. And it's not just assets, but it's also to do with wage rises because at the lower end of the pay scale, where pay is often driven by minimum wage, having significant changes to legislated minimum wage is quite difficult.
Mhm.
But also, if it's minimum wage that's set within the structure of a company, it's a lot harder to change that because we have it in the UK at the moment. So there's lots of strikes at the moment. The nurses historically strike. The train drivers are striking. The pilots are starting to strike because
Mhm.
they all want a rise in their wages. Now, a very small rise for one is a huge increase in the cost for the whole business at once. And so that was another point on that. So I am with you on that. We one of the things though that I think makes a lot of these stories difficult, and I think it's an even harder story for the poor, is the price volatility. And I do wrestle with this because
Yeah.
uh, you and I can buy Bitcoin, and we hopefully have an income elsewhere or other savings. And if it's volatile, yes, it's difficult for us, but at the same time, we still have other income we can
Yeah.
rely on for our day to day. But
We
if
can
you're
ride it out if we need to.
we can ride
Yeah.
it out, but other people maybe can't ride it out. Some people, as you say, live in paycheck to paycheck. Can they really adopt Bitcoin? Can they really use it as their standard? Can they really afford to maybe be hit with a 25% dip one week? That is one area I've not solved, and I've
Yeah.
not squared that circle. And I've struggled with the idea that actually, could we potentially, because of that, actually be creating a Bitcoin wealth gap?
I think that if you're truly living paycheck to paycheck and you have to spend everything that comes in to make it day to day, then you can't save anything.
Hmm.
But if you're into the point where you can save a little, I do think it makes sense to save some in Bitcoin because no matter what you're saving in, you're facing certain death with the dollar
Hmm.
or any other currency you want to pick on the planet, any other fiat currency, right? And history doesn't lie. And you can go back 100 years and your $100,000, 50 years ago would have gone down by just I mean, it's almost not worthless, but it's pretty darn close today. I mean, I know you've interviewed Sailor a couple times and you've been to that house.
Yeah, he told
Well,
me. I've heard the story.
yeah, I mean, that house sold for $100,000, right? In the, what was it, 1920s or something, I
Yeah,
think. And I mean, that house is worth
a lot more now.
a lot more now. But if you think about it, the way it like clicks for some people is if the woman that owned that house would have said, I want to give this money to my great great grandchildren, right? And she sold the house and put the 90 something thousand dollars in a safe deposit box. Those kids would get $90,000 today. If she just had the house and passed on the house, that house would be worth many, many tens of millions of dollars. And so there's your inflation. That is inflation. The $90,000 doesn't buy you shit relative to the appreciation of that house.
How do you deal with explaining the volatility to the higher net worth individuals who want to invest, the potential that they might put a few 100,000, maybe a few million into Bitcoin, and they could have a chance of a 50% haircut over the next year?
Yeah,
How do you deal with explaining that to people?
this is emerging technology.
Okay.
If I think one of the best examples is Amazon.
Hmm.
So from the time that Amazon became a publicly traded company, so it had to grow, have an IPO. So it wasn't truly its infancy. But from the time it was a publicly traded company, I think 6 times it lost 80% of its value as a stock. And one of those six was more than 90%. So there is volatility in technology adoption and valuation. And we're going through that. We're going to continue to go through some of that. But in the longer term, I think that, we're going to see a very clear, as we do now, really, a very clear up and to the right trajectory on price.